Welcome to part 3 of my watercolor painting series entitled How to Paint the Orange Hibiscus Flower. This final chapter will include a detailed demonstration on how to paint water droplets. I hope you enjoy watching the video. I'm going to use an acrylic paintbrush. It's slightly stiffer than my watercolor paintbrushes. And I'm dampening it with a little water. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the dampened acrylic brush to lift out color. Then with some of the color lifted out and the area lightened up, I continue to wet the entire water droplet detail. After the detail dried, I peeled back some of the masking. Now I'm re-dampening the droplet, being careful not to dampen the two little highlights. Reapply the paint to the brush. Begin to work that in. To slightly darken the water droplet and suggest that the petal can be seen through the droplet. Now I'm going to go into my darker color and paint a little along this edge. Some more of that darker color. It'll help me in this area. Sort of a purplish. I think I want to use the wet brush to dampen this area and move the paint around like I did in here. I'm using the existing color for the most part that's already on the paper. And the way this is going to ultimately work is I got to get some highlights in. To work in some of the highlights, I cleaned my brush, then dried the tip a bit. And now I'm lifting out some of the color to establish the highlights. I'm continuing to dab in there with a brush that's been dipped in water. Shake it out to bring it to a nice point, and then I go back in. Bring out a highlight right there. The way I establish this highlight detail is to drag a slightly dampened, clean brush across the surface and lift out paint. Then I rinse the brush in clean water, shake it out, and continue to lift out paint until I achieve the desired result. You can also remove the excess water from your brush by dragging it across a paper towel, and as you drag it, turn it to achieve a beautiful point. Turn and drag, and continue to work out until you get the degree of lightness that you want. Now, using this technique, you're not going to get down to the white of the paper, but that's not my objective. I just want to establish a subtle highlight in certain areas. I'm going to begin to lay in the background now. So the first thing I'm going to do is dampen this area. The flower has been protected with a border of masking, and this area has been protected. And I have the watercolor board on a slight angle, so the paint runs down, not into my flower area. I'm using a large number 12 round synthetic sable brush. Flow in my green color. Masking does help control large washes like this. And a round is a good brush to work with because it has a nice tip that allows me to get close to the edges. Cobalt blue. I see variations in light to dark in this background green, so I'm gonna work into that green that I just applied, which is a mixture of cobalt blue and Winsor yellow. I'm working into that some cobalt blue, and I'm dancing it around because I want to create all types of variations. I also see some hints of yellow ochre, especially near the top over here. I'm not too worried about this area because what's going to happen is I'm going to have a lot of stuff in front of the background washes. The grass bursts up in this way. So this basically is going to be covered. I do want to suggest, though, a slightly darker area over here. And into this area, some hints of brown matter, even some darker quinacridone with cobalt blue. I'm not blending, I'm just placing and allowing it to bleed. I would like to pick out what looks like out of focus leaves with a piece of paper towel. I'm going to blot into this area to lift out some color. It's all wet here, so it's easy to do. And into that, I'm going to place a little aureole yellow. Working in a little bit more of the green. Now I see some nice reds poking through in this area, so I'm blotting up some of the newly applied green color. Throw a little bit of magenta into that area. And I'll continue to develop the burst of green grass. I don't want the paint to be too diluted, so I'm picking up stronger color. Notice how I place my brush where I want the blade of grass to begin. Then I quickly drag it down. I don't work back into individual blades of grass, and my objective is to achieve contrasts between light and dark blades. French Ultramarine Blue. Notice how I'm developing contrasts with light and dark. I'm going to let this entire area dry, and then I'll continue on this side. And I'll work in such a way that I could integrate this with that. I will wet it with my large brush. I think I'll wet into this area because I want what I'm about to paint to integrate thoroughly into this side. For instance, I have some nice burnt sienna that comes down in this area. So I think I want to throw it in. It's very important to have your paint pre-moistened and ready to go, since it's critically important to work wet into wet. All paint must be prepared for application prior to working on an area. I'm working fast and applying the green mixture into wet violet and burnt sienna, and the entire left side of the painting that you see me working on is wet. By applying wet into wet, natural watercolor paint interactions are achieved, and I believe that this is the most beautiful quality of watercolor painting. As I move into this area of the painting, burnt umber becomes more dominant. I'm applying the burnt umber into dampened paper, and the adjacent colors are still wet. I'm adding a little of the violet color. I mix all secondary colors from the basic primaries, and the violet that you see me using is mixed from quinacridone, magenta, and cobalt blue. Some more of the green. As I get close to the flower, I do want to pick up more green to make it appear as if foliage works its way into this area. Yeah. Good. And I'll get some burnt umber. All kinds of neat little organic things going on down here. deep ultramarine blue. I am taking a little neutral tint and working into my mass of colors here, trying to suggest dark areas. And my gut instinct is to get some brown matter in there. Now that the background is laid in, it would be a good time to remove the masking from this area. Using a kneaded eraser, I begin to rub into the surface. And then I grab the masking, and sometimes you could just pull it right off. I actually prefer to pull it off like this rather than continually rub it. I get it started, and then I start pulling. Often the way I tell, aside from visually inspecting it, there's still masking on, is I rub my hand over it, and if there are little tiny areas that I can't see, I usually can feel it. What I'm able to do now is look at the contrast that I've established between foreground elements and see if they stand out enough, and they don't. So I'm going to apply some washes of yellow, Windsor yellow, into this area, and I'll do it gradually to establish more contrast, one layer at a time. I think that one could use a little bit more yellow in it too. Good. I'd also like to tie this area of brown into here. So I'm going to pick up a little burnt sienna in here and in this area so they relate to one another. I think compositionally it's needed. Here I'm gonna go into my neutral tint to darken it. I really want to push that into the shadow. Throw a little neutral tint in here. Picking up some burnt sienna. And working that in. And here. Good. See how that dark ties in this area nicely? As you can see, I already started to add some of the veins. Now I'll continue and show you how to do it. So, let's rotate the image to get into a more comfortable position. And let me introduce a vein over here and maybe down here. My color is ready to go. I have the darker oranges red over here. That's the cadmium scarlet with a little Windsor yellow added. Here I have the quinacridone magenta, and that's all I really need. What I'll do first is dampen the area I want the vein to be. In other words, here's a vein. First, I dampened the area, and the tip of the brush defined the place where the vein would be. It also indicates where the paper is wet and on that side dry. I'm dragging a dampened brush across the surface. The tip of the brush describes the boundary between the damp area and the dry area and shows me exactly where that vein is going to be. Then I go into my color and I flow it into the dampened area. Having done that, I apply some plain water into the area that I just placed the color. When this dries, the water has caused pigment to precipitate down along the border between the dry part and the wet part. And I'll get a nice fine line, sort of like you see over here. Studying the photo very carefully, I see another fine vein in this area. To achieve it, I first dampen the area. Next, I pick up some pigment and flow it into the dampened area. Then, with plain water, I push the newly applied pigment to the perimeter of the wet area, towards the boundary between wet and dry. As I look at this area, I see a fairly strong shadow right here. To achieve this, first I dampen the area. Right now, I'm just going to use my red, my quinacridone magenta. I'll tuck that under, like that, into the dampened area so it bleeds. I may want to achieve a darker value there, but right now I'm going to leave it alone, let it dry, and then think about it. To suggest a vein in here, I see one that comes up and kind of works in like that. Maybe I should have removed that masking. It's kind of annoying. Dampening the area, paying particular attention to the demarcation between damp and dry. That's where I'm going to flow my subtle color, then add additional water. So you see, I don't have to worry about creating a fine line. It's the action of the additional water and flooding the area that will push that pigment along the border to create the fine line. I'll continue to add veins using the technique that I've just demonstrated. First thing to do is dampen the area and establish the edge where the vein will form. Next, wash in color. In this case, I'm using quinacridone magenta. To finish, flow in clean water to push the watercolor paint to the edge of the dampened area. Now I let it dry. I continue to work around the flower, add in the veins. And now I need to remove this masking. I added some green shadows into the anthers. I flowed Winsor yellow into some of the filaments. And I added a little bit of cadmium scarlet to those. Now I'm going to move over to the ones that I haven't touched with the cadmium scarlet. You want these things to sing out with their bright color. The water droplets. Let's for a moment look at the photo and study the anatomy of the water droplet. Each water droplet has a very specific highlight, and they tend to be outlined with a darker rim. And if you observe carefully, you'll notice that the highlights all seem to fall on the same area of the water droplet. I begin by determining the water droplet's foundation color, which in this case will be Winsor red. And I put some Winsor red on my palette mixed to the proper color strength. And what I like to do for basic placement is simply wash in an area of color where I want the droplet to be, using my base color, which is the Winsor red. So I want a large one there. I want a large one over here. I won't do too many at first. How about we get a smaller one down here? As you saw in a photograph, there are hundreds of these droplets. Can't even count them. There's so many on the flower. I'm only going to place a few. Okay, one over there. I think that's good for starters. I've applied my base color, Winsor red, and it has dried. Now I'm using an acrylic paintbrush, which is stiffer than the Sable watercolor brush, to lift out color. I've dampened the brush with clean water, and I'll use it to work out some of the color. So I can lift that out. Good. The process of lifting out color enables me to achieve a darker rim that functions effectively as the edge of the water droplet. Here, this little guy right down there. To accurately paint water droplets, you really have to study their anatomy. And their anatomy consists of highlight, shadow area, and then very strong little highlights. I'll show you how to add them. Now, having established the basic shape with the highlight, I'm going to add some additional colors. To do that, I see an amplification of the yellow in the droplets themselves. A water droplet is like a prism, and it'll alter certain colors, usually making some a little bit more intense. I like to add a little bit of Windsor yellow there. Now I'm going to go into a darker color. That mixture that you've seen me use throughout this painting. Get some strong color on my brush. Sometimes I wipe a little off on the side just to make sure it's not going to come gushing out. And then I look to see where the dark area is on the bead of water. I begin to work that in. The dark is such an important detail. Okay, it's here too. I work it in. I observe very carefully how the line fades from thick to thin, from strong to light. And here. And I notice how that shade tends to be on the same side of the droplet on each one. Also, I see in this droplet there's a subtle indication that the line of the vein has been bent, visually bent by the droplet. So, sometimes I re-dampen the area. Then I picked up a little of the red. And right there, I'm going to just touch it. I make my mark, but I allow the watercolor to do its own thing. Two more things to do with the droplets. There are some lighter values on the surface that I can't possibly get with my brush. So I'm going to use the Incredible Nib. Now, be careful with this. It's an abrasive tool. How do I use it? In this situation, weten the droplet itself. And then I just ever so slightly work into the surface. Blot, and I see some highlight values over here too. Hardly using any pressure. I don't want to damage the watercolor surface, but it is removing a small amount of paper and paint. Working with the Incredible Nib is usually the very last thing that I do because scraping the paper's surface changes the way it responds to paint. The paint would absorb into the area that I use this abrasive tool on differently than the surrounding area, and it would be a disaster. So you use a tool like this only when you know all the painting has been done. It's a wonderful tool because you can develop a controlled highlight. There is still one last thing I want to do. I'm going to use a razor blade to get a very specific, sharp focus highlight on each one. Water droplets often cast shadows, and I do see some shadows. I didn't see that at first. There's a slight shadow there. There's a slight shadow there. So to add the shadow, I'm taking clean water, and I'm damping along the perimeter of the water droplet there, and I'll carry that down to here. Then I'm going to go into my Windsor red and just touch the area. and let it bleed on its own. Same thing over here, just touch it. Now for the final detail. I'm going to take my razor blade and scratch out some of the lightest highlights. The water droplets will have the lightest highlights in the entire painting. They're sun glares, basically. I continue to add more water droplets on the flower's petals, and I also brought one down to this leaf because I thought it was compositionally necessary. The painting is finished. Hope you enjoyed watching the video on how to paint the orange hibiscus flower.